Today we're talking about one of the hardest moments in a clinical trial, when a data safety monitoring board may recommend that the trial be terminated early, not at the planned endpoint, not after all the events accrue. Stopping can be the most ethical choice, or it can leave behind an evidence base that overstates benefits and understates risks. So, how do you tell the difference? These decisions can get messy fast.
Messy is exactly the right word. The public version is there's a p-value boundary, it's crossed, everyone high fives, trial over. The real version is closer to you're holding people's lives in one hand and scientific credibility in the other, and you're trying not to drop either.
To make this concrete, we're going to approach this topic through two exemplar trials that led to two very different kinds of recommendations for terminating early. We'll include references to both trials in the episode description. The first takes us to South Africa in the mid-2000s and involves infants living with HIV. Can you tell us about that trial and what exactly was being tested?
This is the CHER trial, which asked the question about when antiretroviral therapy should begin in infants with HIV. Without treatment, HIV can progress much faster in infants than in adults, with a very high risk of severe illness and death in the first years of life. In many cases, infants could deteriorate quickly, sometimes before clinicians had much time to respond. But starting treatment early was not a simple decision. There were real concerns about beginning lifelong therapy at just a few weeks of age, including drug toxicity, adherence challenges, and the possibility of resistance over time. So clinicians were facing a genuine dilemma: start early and accept the burdens of long-term treatment, or wait and risk rapid disease progression. The basic question was this: for HIV-infected infants who still looked relatively healthy immunologically, do you wait until certain CD4 or clinical triggers appear, or do you start antiretroviral therapy right away? The trial enrolled infants about 6 to 12 weeks old with a CD4 percentage of at least 25%.
Of course, I know exactly what changes in CD4 percentages mean, but for our audience, what does it mean for an infant to have a CD4 percentage of at least 25%?
Right. So in plain terms, CD4 percentage is a way of measuring how strong the immune system is. In infants, a CD4 percentage of 25% or higher suggests the immune system is still relatively intact and hasn't been severely weakened by HIV. So these were not infants who were already very sick.
Okay, got it. So one group started treatment right away, while the other was monitored closely and only started treatment later if certain clinical or immune thresholds were reached.
Exactly. It was a structured, protocol-driven wait.
Now we jump to June 2007. There's an annual review by the Data and Safety Monitoring Board. What did they see?
The trial had an explicit monitoring plan. The protocol says the board reviews at least annually, and there's even a subcommittee reviewing deaths by randomized group every few months. And they set a very high bar for an early efficacy signal, what they called proof beyond a reasonable doubt, basically a Habital pedo style threshold, nominal p less than 0.001 at an interim look.
Beyond a reasonable doubt. Sounds like courtroom language.
It is. It's the trial saying, if we stop early for benefit, we want to be extremely sure.
And then?
At that second annual review in mid-2007, accrual was already complete, and strong evidence of mortality differences had emerged between early treatment and deferred treatment. The report states the board recommended disseminating the early findings and urgently evaluating the infants in the deferred group who were not on therapy yet to consider starting treatment.
What does mortality difference mean in numbers?
The interim report showed that after a median follow-up of 40 weeks, 20 infants in the deferred group died, that's 16%, versus 10 infants in the early therapy groups, 4%. The hazard ratio for death was 0.24, with a p-value less than 0.001. That's not a subtle nudge, that's a cliff.
Indeed it is.
And it wasn't just death. Progression to severe disease was also much higher in the deferred group. Importantly, the paper says that after the board reviewed the data, the deferred group was modified, and infants were reassessed for starting therapy. So, stopping early here is not everyone go home. It's, we can't justify leaving these infants on a waiting strategy anymore.
So the ethical move is update what you're doing to participants in real time.
Exactly. Stopping is a verb, not a button. It means changing the risk-benefit balance for people currently in the trial. And CHER shows a clean example of that logic. Pre-specified conservative guideline, major mortality signal, rapid protective action for the deferred group.
Did it change the world outside the trial?
Yes, and this is where early stopping has downstream consequences. The World Health Organization describes that dramatic survival benefits from starting infants on ART as early as possible prompted a review, and a year later, the WHO issued guidance recommending prompt initiation of ART in infants diagnosed with HIV infection. That's an example of trial monitoring feeding directly into global clinical guidance.
It's hard to find a more tangible benefit-stopping story than infants dying less often.
That's why CHER is so frequently taught. Mortality is hard to argue with, and the effect size is enormous early in life. But we still have to be careful as a general rule. Stopping early for benefit can exaggerate effect sizes, especially when the number of outcome events is small.
Let's underline that because people think early stopping equals strong evidence.
Sometimes it does. But systematically, it's risky. There's a classic systematic review of randomized trials stopped early for benefit, showing an inverse relationship. The fewer events, the bigger the apparent treatment effect. And it found that many trials did not report basic details needed to interpret the stopping decision, like the planned sample size, which interim analysis triggered stopping, and what rule was used. So if you're reading a stopped early for benefit trial result, skepticism is a feature, not a bug.
Okay, that's benefit. Now we pivot to the other side, where the Data Safety Monitoring Board recommends stopping because continuing might be pointless or dangerous or both. Can you tell us about the ALTITUDE trial?
ALTITUDE is the opposite emotional arc. It's a large, global cardiovascular and renal outcomes trial. The setup? People with type 2 diabetes who already have renal impairment and/or cardiovascular disease are randomized to aliskiren or placebo on top of background therapy that already blocks the renin-angiotensin system, so ACE inhibitor or ARB use.
And we should say what trial endpoint?
It was a major composite endpoint that included cardiovascular death, resuscitated sudden death, non-fatal MI, non-fatal stroke, heart failure hospitalization, plus renal outcomes like doubling of serum creatinine sustained, end-stage renal disease, renal death. The safety alert describing the trial also emphasizes scale. About 8,606 patients across 36 countries, and a planned follow-up of 4 years.
So big, serious, expensive, and potentially practice-changing. When does the recommendation for early termination happen?
In late 2011, at the second interim analysis reviewed by the Independent Data Monitoring Committee, the key detail is that they were not acting on a tiny sliver of information. They report that 69% of the projected primary events had already accrued.
And at that point, what did the committee see?
No benefit and harm signals. The interim hazard ratio for the primary composite outcome was 1.09, with a confidence interval that straddled 1 and a p-value of about 0.17. So, no evidence the drug helped, and the point estimate is actually in the wrong direction.
That's already sobering. But no benefit alone doesn't always stop a trial.
Right. That's where futility analysis comes in. By design, the trial expected something like a 15% risk reduction, or a hazard ratio of 0.85. The safety alert describes a conditional probability calculation. Under that design assumption, the probability that the study would demonstrate benefit by the end was less than 0.0001. In plain language, basically near zero chance you're going to rescue this into a success story.
And what was the harm signal?
The same interim package reports higher rates of stroke, renal serious adverse events, hyperkalemia, and hypotension in the aliskiren group than placebo. And based on that combination, futility plus safety concerns, the Data Monitoring Committee recommended all subjects stop taking aliskiren.
So once that recommendation was made, what happened?
The European Medicines Agency, or EMA, started a review after being informed in late 2011 of the decision to terminate ALTITUDE early, explicitly stating the independent committee recommended stopping due to no benefit and more cases of stroke, renal complications, hyperkalemia, and hypotension.
And what did that review lead to?
The European Medicines Agency's review led to new contraindications and warnings. In early 2012, regulators specifically moved against combining aliskiren with ACE inhibitors or ARBs in patients with diabetes or impaired renal function. Beyond the EMA, the FDA also issued a label update for aliskiren products.
So if CHER is the story of the drug works so well we can't keep waiting, ALTITUDE is the drug doesn't work and might hurt people, so we have to stop.
Yes. And there's a key insight there. Early termination is not a single category. ALTITUDE is a combined decision, futility and harm. Committees often have to synthesize those.
Let's step back and extract the general principles. If you're on a data safety monitoring board, what are you weighing?
I'd summarize it as 5 big considerations. First, pre-specification and integrity. Interim analyses should be planned in advance, described in the protocol, and conducted in a confidential way that keeps investigators blind to unblinded comparisons. That's in core statistical guidance for trials, because once people know interim results, behavior changes and bias leaks in. Second, the asymmetry between benefit and harm. You generally need very strong evidence to stop early for efficacy, but you may act on less conservative signals to stop for safety concerns. That's an ethical asymmetry baked into guidance and practice. Third, the information size problem. Early benefit signals can be random highs. Stopping early trades ethical advantages for risks like effect overestimation, limited safety, and less subgroup information. And systematic reviews show those risks are not theoretical. Fourth, futility as probability, not disappointment. A good futility analysis asks whether continuing is likely to change the conclusion. ALTITUDE's conditional probability story is exactly that. Fifth, what happens next? If you stop, you inherit obligations, including how to manage participants safely, what data to keep collecting, and how you will explain the stopping decision to the world. And the evidence shows reporting is often weak, which is a problem because policy and practice shift based on these decisions.
That last one is underrated. People treat stopping like an ending, but is it more like a fork in the road?
It is. For CHER, the fork went toward implementation. Reassess deferred infants. And soon after, global guidance shifts toward prompt infant treatment. For altitude, the fork went toward risk communication, contraindications, warnings, and changes to prescribing. And both forks require the world to trust that the stopping decision was grounded, not hasty.
Final question. If you could give listeners one mental model for reading "trial stopped early" in a paper, what would it be?
Ask 3 questions. 1. Why exactly did it stop? Benefit, harm, futility, or some combination? If it's benefit, demand to see the stopping rule and how many events drove the decision. If you don't, your brain will overtrust the result. 2. How much information did the trial have at the time of stopping? Altitude had around 2/3 of events accrued at its key interim analysis. CHER had an enormous relative mortality difference at a very early, high-risk stage of infant life and a conservative boundary. Those are different information stories. 3. What protections were in place to prevent bias and preserve credibility? Confidential interim analyses and well-specified monitoring plans are the backbone.
That's a great place to close. Trials don't stop early because the calendar says so. They stop early because the accumulating data can change what is ethically acceptable, whether that means stopping for benefit, harm, or futility. CHER and ALTITUDE are 2 clear, dramatic examples of that. Thank you for listening. If you found this content helpful, make sure to follow and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you have thoughts or questions about today's content, drop a comment.